Thank you, Ambassador. That was a very, very thorough analysis of the situation in Ukraine, both historical and contemporary, and you have dealt on the causes of the problems, etc., and made sort of given out your message through several anecdotes, and each of them have been full of meaning, so to say. I mean, like metaphor in a biblical sense. Anyway, I'm opening the floor to questions, comments from the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, if you will identify yourself as you speak for the sake of the record as well. Yes, while they are sort of preparing themselves for the... You want to... Okay. No, I just wanted to... Well, we spoke a bit about the UN, etc. Now, throughout the periodicity of the Soviet Socialist Republics, I mean USSR, Ukraine had a seat in the United Nations, so the member of the United Nations, along with, as far as I can recall, Belarus. Now, what was the understanding between Kiev and Moscow at that point in time? Why did Stalin allow Ukraine a separate membership of the United Nations, which technically could be viewed as separate sovereignty by many, but we all know that it was not a sovereign entity? Ambassador.
Doctor, as far as I remember from your CV, you spent, and from your story, you told me that you served in the United Nations for a certain period of time. And it was not the matter of being permitted or not by Stalin. Stalin did his best. He vigorously insisted that Ukraine and Belarus become countries founders of the United Nations. Yeah. This was because of the simple understanding by then Bolsheviks regime and Stalin by himself that the majority of those in the United Nations would not be pro-Soviet. And he simply wanted to have more voices in the United Nations. So the story is as simple as that. But on the other hand, of course, since it was legally done absolutely correct, with all procedures and papers done correctly, Ukraine and Belarus since then are counted country founders of the United Nations. And of course, don't mention about any kind of interaction between delegations of the Soviet Union and Belarus and Ukraine. It was complete subordination. If I am not mistaken, a couple of times Ukrainian delegation voted somewhat differently from the Soviet Union, but most likely it was a part of some game. Since collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, the story became different. But you made me recall of the status of Russia as a successor of the Soviet Union. This is another matter which is really very significant and which is not thoroughly depicted in the United Nations Charter. Legally, this, well, the decision was political. It is not based on the provisions of the United Nations Charter. So, Moscow plays in the United Nations Security Council is quite disputable, as according to rules, which Russia ignores totally.
It's an interesting point that you raise, that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, how Russia continues to remain a member of the United Nations. By the way, I was a good friend of Valery Kuczynski, who was your representative to the United Nations. Mr. Suryanarayana, I see you raring to go.
I don't know whether you have read the latest issue of Foreign Affairs. The editor of Foreign Affairs has written that, for Obama, President Obama, the Ukrainian issue as it exists today is not a core issue for him, because Obama recognizes that Ukraine comes under the sphere of influence of the Russian Federation. I don't know whether after Obama's speech in the UNGA, do you agree with that proposition of the editor of Foreign Affairs? I don't know whether you read the article, but this is what he has said. And secondly, why did you give up nuclear weapons, and how did it happen? If only you had nuclear weapons, I'm sure Russia would not have attacked you.
Okay.
I was very careful listening to what Mr. Obama pronounced yesterday in at the General Assembly on Ukraine. And I even put down some words of him. I failed to check his speech today because of technical problems, but still. The editorial, which is a replica of many similar opinions, seemed to be affected by Kremlin's propaganda. Well, I don't like conspiracy, but as a human being, and most of us are the same, we look attentively of what is written, what is said, what kind of rumors are around this or that issue. Kremlin propaganda is heavily financed, unimaginably heavily financed. I cannot accuse anybody because I'm not a prosecutor and I'm not a God, I don't know. But if you look attentively of what is written in this article and what American president said addressing the United Nations, there is a big difference. I'm very much convinced that United States support of Ukraine sovereignty and independence, I would refrain from the word core, but it is really essential. And well, I cannot insist that we can defeat Russia by ourselves. It's not possible. It's our dream. Look, Singapore, mighty state, strong state, very much integrated, very much resilient. But if it is haze coming from Sumatra to Singapore, can you protect your borders? Sometimes I can put a parallel between situation in Ukraine and in Russia. Whatever happens inside Russia, and it is deeply contaminated with many diseases, leaks to Ukraine, leaks to other countries around Russia. In this or that form, either it is northern territories in relations between Russia and Japan, or Arctic rim with Russian attempts to control huge spaces of the ocean. Everywhere wherever Russia appears on the surface, like in Syria, we have complications, we have problems, we have millions of migrants. In Ukraine itself, we have 1.5 million internal migrants, internally displaced people. And now about a nuclear arsenal. We possessed the third biggest nuclear arsenal. Ukraine was a stronghold of Moscow against West. And 1/3 of the missiles were deployed on Ukrainian territory. I would say it was extremely strong pressure over Ukraine since very first hours of independence. Together with recognition of Ukraine, at the same time, the most powerful countries insisted, get rid of your nuclear arsenal. It is our condition. In 1994, we managed to sign with Great Britain, United States, and Russia so-called Budapest Memorandum. France did a separate statement on the matter, and even China joined it in special manner. But as far as it was a political document, Mr. Putin said that it was not approved by the Parliament of Russian Federation. So Boris Yeltsin put his signature. That's his responsibility. Imagine Ukraine possess nuclear weapon. At least a couple of bombs. I don't believe these circumstances can stop Russia from invasion. Because in Ukraine, I don't see such madmen who can press a button directed at anywhere. This is our problem of Ukrainians. We will not kill people who are not soldiers fighting on the front line. Even Crimea, you did not ask the question, but very often I'm asked about Crimea. You did not open fire, why? 2.5 million people living on the peninsula. Can you imagine that Ukrainian army, whether weak and badly armed, start fighting? How many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people could be already dead on this terrain? Well, Ukraine is deprived of this peninsula nowadays. But civilized world does not recognize occupation of Crimea. This is another big problem.
Well, you mentioned, actually, there are other republics also which had nuclear weapons, Kazakhstan, for instance. Belarus also. But these were part of the arrangements, not just with Moscow, but with the big powers as well, that all of them had to surrender the nuclear weapons. Yeah, is there a two-finger? Yeah.
But the same United States, which applied so much pressure
Yes.
on you
Yes.
to give up nuclear weapons. Now, do you trust the same United States to help you?
Okay.
And the second question is, what do you make of China's and India's? I mean, they don't support you. What is your take on that?
Tough question. Tough but very realistic one. I would answer you in the same manner. Ukrainians were systematically exterminated for centuries. Believe me, by the end of 1913, the population of Ukraine was almost 40 million people. Do you know the number of Ukrainians now? 45. 90 years after. What other country in the world have same results? No one. We will withstand, we will cope with problems. We are thankful to those who are supportive. We understand those who sit quiet and refrain from interference. We dislike those who are supportive of our enemy. This is not a matter of belief or disbelief. Washington or whoever, or whatever other entity. This is our own task to prove that we deserve true independence, that we can live without being subordinate to Kremlin, to Moscovia, the Ulus of Golden Horde, which is now being disintegrating because of the internal weakness. The projection of Russian problems around the world is the decline of this empire. One more question you asked me.
India and China.
India and China. Well, you know BRICS. Yeah. Wonderful solution for those who are disappointed with the Western domination. And India, China is a different story, but in case of India, I understand that there were so-called natural partners for the last decades, or many decades, in line. With the present Prime Minister, I would say the situation changed to different. I'm not an expert in India-Russian relations, but I understand. I had nothing but to understand that many times, many times, when Ukraine approached Delhi with some initiatives, with some concrete deals, the Moscow lobby in the country immediately compromised Ukrainians at any level with any kind of transaction. Well, I mentioned this in my lecture, just didn't plunge in details. In case of China, have you ever seen any country in the world which was unconditionally supported by China? Don't mention North Korea, it's absolutely a special case. We have quite cooperative relations with our Chinese partners. And, to say the truth, we are thankful that China refrained from voting against Ukraine on the 27th of March a year ago, because temptation was huge. But look at this waste country with its internal questions, internal problems, with growing might, with complications in economy. Russia pretends it has a very special, very amicable, and very prospective relations with China. I don't believe. I lived in China, worked in China. I'm sinologist. So, in fact, Russia cannot be an equal partner of China. This is our advantage.
Okay. Well, interesting. You mentioned foreign affairs. By the way, for the sake of the younger colleagues, the article by Kennan, he had mentioned earlier, was also in Foreign Affairs in 1951, and it was signed X, and that was the article where he famously mentioned containment of Russia. So that was what you are referring to, right? Okay.
Cold War.
Yes, Cold War. Yes, Professor Riaz.
I'm just going to ask, you have mentioned the number of former Soviet republics. Some have become part of EU, like the Baltic republics. Ukraine is struggling, at least trying to assert its independence, and is succeeding. Belarus, Moldova, they have suffered a lot. But there are a number of other republics, for example, in Central Asia. And I was curious I was interested in finding out what is their position in relation to the struggle or the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. For example, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Now, the other thing that I wanted to ask, both Ukraine and Kazakhstan are very similar in terms of the size. Of course, Kazakhstan is much bigger, but Ukraine is a huge country, has resource-rich, and so is Kazakhstan. And about 1/3 of Kazakhstan is Russian, if I'm not mistaken. I think 36%. When I was working there, 36% of the Kazakhstan were Russians. And they were in the process of changing their capital from Almaty to Astana, and I asked them why. They said, we don't want to be too close to Chinese border or too close to Russian border. We want to be somewhere in the middle, so that Moscow and Beijing are equal distance from us. I'm not sure whether there was a joke or not, but I was very intrigued by the fact that Russia did not factor very much in Kazakhstan affairs. And Kazakhstan has been following policies which, it's been some years since I was there, but I was just curious, one thing, what is the policies of other Russian republic towards Ukraine? I mean conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And secondly, given the similarities between Ukrainian and Kazakhstan situation, in the sense that both are resource rich, both have a very sizable number of Russian populations, what explains the difference between Russia's attitudes towards Kazakhstan and Ukraine? I mean, maybe it's not a relevant question, but just thought if it makes sense to you, perhaps you can share some comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You said you lived in Kazakhstan, yeah, a certain time. Well, first of all, 66%, it's not correct, of Russians is not correct.
No, he's at 30,
Yeah.
30, 36. 36.
36, okay. But in general, Kazakhstan, in my view, from the point of view of Kremlin, has no alternative except being an ally of Russian Federation. As concerning Ukraine, the situation is particularly different. If you remember, I remind you of my words about Russians talking about Ukraine, that this nation doesn't exist. They can acknowledge Kazakh, looks different, speak absolutely different, etc., etc. But in case of Ukraine, for 350 years, Moscow pretends this nation does not exist. They don't have language. They were tiered between two or three empires in different times. Kazakhstan does not constitute any threat for Russian Empire. And being deprived of access to the sea, being deprived of maritime capabilities, these Central Asian countries, well, you mentioned Uzbekistan, it's a little bit different. Luckily for Uzbekistan, this country doesn't have common border with Russia. This is exceptional advantage of Uzbekistan in comparison with the rest of entities in the Central Asia. China is in Kazakhstan already. Same as in Siberia. Millions of communications, and growing with this Silk Road, the main one, not newly declared. Ukraine, for the loss of Ukraine for Russia is a real disaster. Why? Russia exists as an empire, as a big power, with Ukrainian brains and defense complex. And, of course, a source, excuse me for such wording, but a source of white people. This is extremely dangerous for the mere existence of Ukraine, because Moscow never regarded this nation as a country. It is still in the mentality of the majority of Russians that Ukrainians just a bad boy with poor behavior. The government of Ukraine is called junta. Political powers who are supportive of nationhood are named Nazis, extreme right wings, and deserving only tribunal somewhere in Hague or other good places. So, if Ukraine manage to succeed, it will inevitably put a huge brick into the coffin, nail, into the coffin of Russian Empire.
Well, I suspected that it has to do with the European Union. The difference between Kazakhstan has no choice. It can't be part of European Union, whereas the Ukraine can be. And I think that looks to me. And also, I think the other part is that the demography of both countries is very different, because Russian population is going down. The mortality has increased. The average lifespan has decreased. In fact, poverty in Russia is going up. All the evidence, the recent evidence is that poverty in Russia has increased. In fact, the further you go away from Moscow, and I just wonder, I don't know how much the internal demographic shift and the increasing poverty in Russia is partly responsible for the conflict that is taking place now between your country and Russia.
Ukraine is self-sufficient,
Not Russia.
not Russia. The 97% of the net income in 2014 of 500 biggest companies in Russia attributes to oil and gas export. 97%. You remember McCain? McCain, he said that this is a gas station, Russia, pretending, masquerading state. Of course, well, Mr. McCain is not very often quoted in among scholarships. But to say the truth, the exclusively dependent on natural resources country, as Russia, cannot survive. We can. We are very much different in terms of our economy, of the level of education of people. The management is poor. Management is really poor until
Also-
today.
I mean, Ukrainian membership, by the way, of the European Union is slotted for 2020, is it? I mean, is that a...
Since the 1st of January 2016, the associative agreement between
Yeah.
Ukraine and European Union, associative agreement,
yeah,
entered into force.
okay.
Russia managed to convince our Western partners to delay, to postpone the entering into force of this agreement, but it will be valid in full capacity since the 1st of January.
Okay.
It is not the membership. It is nothing in common with
No,
membership.
the application will be made for membership in 2020, I think, isn't it? Is that a...
What kind of EU we will have in 2020? Do you know? I don't know.
Okay. We have now very good discussions, but we have reached the end of our deliberations for this afternoon. Ambassador Sultansky, may I, on behalf of ISAS, thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us and illuminating us on the issues of Ukraine and how it also reflects on our part of the world, South Asia. You've touched on Ukraine's relationship with India and the sort of thing that the influence of big powers have on determining attitudes and postures of other countries vis-à-vis Ukraine. Thank you very much once again, and we would hope to continue our relationship that is now, I hopefully firmly established. This is the second time you are here, and I'm sure these linkages will continue. Might I invite all of you to a tea reception over there, and we will continue our interactions with you through tea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.